Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's great to be with all of you, and to see you all. Thankful to be here. If you're visiting, know that we're thankful to have you again, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Today, we're going to be looking at the story found in 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's the story of David and Goliath. For the past 40 days, the champion fighter for the Philistines has challenged King Saul and the Israelite army. But this is not like the other days. Unlike the previous 40 mornings and evenings, where Goliath would stand out in front of the Israelite army and taunt them, today there was a challenger. As the army stood on both sides of the valley up on the mountaintops, and they looked down where Goliath and his challenger were, it's as if time has frozen in place. As they stared in unbelief, the unthinkable, the unbelievable has happened. The small, young shepherd boy David is holding the head of Goliath in his hands. There are challenges that we face at times that appear to be unsurmountable. Moments in life that create uncertainty and doubt. Situations that get bigger than they should. Whether it's in our life, it's financial issues and struggles, or whether I'm going to be able to keep my job or not because there's being people laid off. Or maybe it's relationships that are broken, or health concerns that we have with ourselves or family members. There are moments in life that start to create uncertainty and doubt, or fear in our life. But what separates the courageous from the fearful, the victorious from the defeated, the strong from the weak, is not greater self-reliance or self-dependence or self-confidence, but is rooted in something much, much greater. As we look at this epic story in the Bible, this story that is one of the most popular Bible stories probably of all time, one that could be made into many great movies and would be really popular. But do we ever ask the question, why was David fighting Goliath? Why was David fighting Goliath? As we look at this story, we see that the author really answers this for us. But to truly understand the depth of what is being said, we really need to know some of the backstory to how the Israelites got to this moment in time where King Saul and his army are facing against the Philistines. You see, the Israelites had not always been under a king like King Saul. For many, many years and generations, they were led by judges like Samuel. But as Samuel got older and was coming to the end of his time, the elders of Israel, they looked at the nations around them, and they saw that they had a king that ruled them, that protected them. And they were like, man, we want to be like the other nations. We want a king to rule us. This didn't please Samuel at all. But God revealed to Samuel that they hadn't rejected him. Rather, they had rejected God as their king, as their protector. You know, there's the ever-present threat of being swayed to look like the culture that surrounds us. There's the ever-present danger of wanting to look like that which is around us that isn't of God. And unless we daily check ourselves against the Word of God, then we too can fall into that trap of wanting to desire to look like the people around us who are not God's children. But God granted their request. He showed Samuel that Saul was his chosen king, and Samuel ends up finding Saul, and he anoints him as the king of Israel. And he ends up gathering the nation of Israel together. And in their midst, God chooses Saul to be their king. And as they're all standing there with Saul, who it says is a head taller than any of the other Israelites. And to make it worse, not only is he taller, but it says he's better looking than any of the other men. But he's standing there, and Samuel looks at him and says, "Behold, the chosen one of God." And as they're all standing there, the people of Israel, they all cry out, "Long live the king." Saul was to protect and to rule the Israelites. And not long after this, he's given opportunity. He's given opportunity to do just that. As the Ammonites, a neighboring nation, another nation, comes and they attack some of the Israelites. And so Saul, he calls the men of Israel and the men of Judah, and there's 330,000 men that come. And they fight the Ammonites, and they're victorious. And Saul wins the heart of the people. But then they start to praise Saul and to attribute this victory to Saul. And Samuel quickly corrects them. Whoa, wait a second here. Our salvation is from the Lord. You know, when we come through different challenges, when we have different victories, at times it can be tempting to put our praise and our thanks in the wrong place. And we must always remember where our providing has come from, where our protection has come from, and that's God. But as Samuel's time is coming to an end, Samuel leaves the Israelite nation. He leaves them with instructions. He says to them, "Fear God, serve Him, obey His commands, follow His instructions." He says, if you do this, it will be well with you. But if you do not do this, the hand of the Lord will be against you. And he applies this to the Israelites, but also to King Saul. And 2 years pass, and things begin to unravel for Saul. They begin to spiral downward. As instead of listening to the voice of God, he begins to listen to the voice of men. Why? Because he begins to fear men over fearing God. He begins to fear his enemies over fearing God's commands. He begins to fear those whom he's leading, the Israelites, instead of listening to the Lord's instructions. And as a result of his fear of men, he does things that are not pleasing to God. And as a result, God rejects Saul as the king of Israel. Samuel is tore up. He is a mess. He is weeping over this. That Saul has been rejected because of his actions. And God says to Samuel, he says to him, "How long are you going to weep over Saul?" He said, "Get up. Get your oil. For I have a chosen instrument, a chosen king from Jesse's sons." And so Samuel, he gets up in obedience. He gets up, takes his oil, and he heads to Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And he gets there, and he says to Jesse, he says, "Bring your sons, we're going to have a sacrifice to the Lord." Because he wants to see each of his sons. And so they get there, and he's waiting, and I can imagine he's waiting in anticipation, knowing that God is going to show him who the next king of Israel is. And as he's coming, and he sees the sons as they begin to come, Jesse doesn't just have 2 or 3 sons. No, Jesse has 8 sons. So how is he going to know who the king of Israel is going to be? Well, as Eliab comes, Eliab, the oldest son of Jesse, Samuel looks at him and says, "Man, this must be him." You see, Samuel was judging from the outside and looking at his outward appearance. He saw that he was tall, that he was the oldest. And he said, this must be him. He judged from the appearance of Eliab. And if we, as a church, judge people from the outside and not look at people's hearts, we put ourselves in a very unhealthy spot. And the Lord quickly corrects Samuel. He says, don't look at the outward appearance. For I do not look as man looks. I don't look on the outside. No, I, as God, look at the heart of man. And he said, I have rejected Eliab as the king. And as one by one, the sons of Jesse come before Samuel. One by one, they are rejected by God as the future king of Israel. And Samuel, he turns to Jesse and he says, do you have any more sons? He's probably thinking, none of these are the king of Israel. And Jesse says, well, yeah, my youngest is watching the sheep. Didn't actually bother to bring him. And so Samuel says, he says, quickly get him. We will not sit until he comes. And as his youngest son gets there, and Samuel sees him, the Lord reveals to him that to get up, anoint him, he is my chosen king. And once again, he follows obediently, he gets up, and he anoints David in front of his brothers. It's here we begin to see a contrast between David and Saul. In 2 verses, we quickly see that the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon David, but leaves Saul. It rushes upon David and leaves Saul. And Saul, actually, it says, is given a harmful spirit that torments him. So much so that he seeks after somebody who can play an instrument, probably a lot better than me, who can play an instrument to soothe him. And so a young man that's around Saul, he hears this and he says, behold, I know the man. He's actually a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite. He's skilled in music. He's good in his speech. He's a man of valor, a man of war. And the irony of it all is that this man happens to be David. David, the anointed, the chosen king of Israel, becomes a servant to Saul, the rejected king of Israel. I believe the author here gives us a glimpse into the heart of David. Because David doesn't serve Saul in a spiteful way. No, but David serves in such a way that he wins the favor of Saul. It says that Saul greatly loved David. See, David faithfully serves him, although he was the anointed king, future king of Israel. And now we shift back to the battle, the opening battle, where the Philistines and the Israelites, they have met. You see, during Saul's reign, there was continually hard fighting between the Philistines and the Israelites. So this wasn't unusual. At this particular time, the Philistines, they had come out of their territory into Judah. And they wanted to capture a key valley so that they would have easy access into Judah. Obviously, the Israelites, they didn't take too kindly to this. They didn't like that, and so they gather their armies together. And the Israelites meet the Philistines. It says that they meet one on one mountainside and the other on the other mountain, with a valley that is between them. And as they're standing there, both armies, emotions are high, blood is pumping. I can't imagine. To stand in battle formation with swords and spears and arrows and to be ready for war, really not knowing what is about to happen. They're there and they're anticipating action. And out from behind the Philistine line steps out a man. And as this man steps out from behind the Philistine line, all hope of the Israelites is gone. Their hearts sink as this man takes a step, each step towards them. And with each step, it's as if the ground is shaking beneath them, but maybe it's just their knees that are rattling together from fear. Because this is no ordinary man. This is the champion fighter for the Philistines, Goliath. Now, Charles is a big man. Leo is a big man. But compared to Goliath, both of them would look very small. Goliath, standing at 3 meters tall, 9 foot 9 inches tall. Charles and Leo would not even come to the shoulders of Goliath. And if you think of his sheer size of Goliath, that's intimidating. But when they would have looked down and saw him, this humongous man, who is fully clothed in armor with a helmet and with a shield that covers his whole body in front of him, Goliath would have looked undefeatable. He would have looked undefeatable to the Israelites. And as Goliath stood before them, with an air of unmatched self-confidence, it's like his words are spitting daggers at the Israelites. As he looks at them and he says to them, "Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself who will fight me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants." And with venom on his lips, he adds this. He says, "I defy the ranks of Israel. Send someone to fight me." And as King Saul and the Israelite army, as they see him, and as they hear his words, are terrified of Goliath. Meanwhile, David, who's been serving Saul, he actually goes back and forth from Saul to his father Jesse. And at this moment, David is with his father Jesse, watching the sheep of his father. And Jesse's oldest 3 sons are actually following Saul, and they're at this battle. And Jesse says to David, he says, "Go and see how it is with your brothers. Bring back a report. Take them some supplies." You know, God always has a way of getting us to the place that we need to be. But do we seize the opportunity that lies in front of us? Or do we cower in fear, as we saw that King Saul did? Fear of failure, fear of defeat, fear of embarrassment, maybe even fear of being successful, fear of whatever it may be. As we look at our challenges that we are facing, they become larger and larger. But we must never focus too much on those. Rather, we must see the strength of our God, not the size of our challenge. And as David obediently listened to his father, he went to the battle. And as he got there, he saw that these armies were already on the mountainside, lined for war. He puts down his baggage and he runs to the battle line. He finds his brothers and he's talking to them. He's speaking to them. And as he's speaking to them, out walks Goliath from behind the Philistine line, speaking the same words as he spoke before, challenging them. And just as before, the Israelites, they turn and they flee out of fear. But this day was different. This day wasn't like the other days, because this day, David heard it. And as David is watching, I can just picture him being like, who does this guy think he is? as he says to those around him, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine who thinks he can defy the armies of the living God?" Man, what a contrast to everyone else. And as he is there, he is asking those around him, what happens to the man who kills this man? Because he sees the strength of his God, not the size of the challenger, Goliath. And as he is asking those around them, questioning those that are around him, his oldest brother, Eliab, begins to get angry at him, begins to mock him, and to question David's heart as to what the motives were behind him coming to the battle. And David looks like, man, I'm just asking questions. And he turns and he continues to ask people these questions. I find that when we get in moments that are truly testing our faith, that are truly big challenges that we are facing, oftentimes there happen to be people around us that are speaking discouragement and lies into our hearts. And it's, do we grab hold of those and let them take root, or do we get rid of them and grab hold of the truth of the Word of God and hold fast to that? And that's what we must do. David didn't let that discourage him, thankfully, and neither must we. We must see the strength of our God and not the size of the challenge. And as David is boldly proclaiming this to these people that are around him, his words get back to Saul. And then he has to come. Saul calls him and he comes before King Saul. And he says to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of this man. Your servant will go and fight the Philistine." And Saul looks at him. He looks at David, not seeing how great his faith is in his strong God, but pointing out the failures he brings, what he doesn't bring to the table. He says to David, "You can't fight Goliath." He says, "You're but a youth. You're a boy." And Goliath has been a warrior from his youth. David, thankfully, doesn't let this dishearten him, but goes to share with Saul how God has been faithful to him in the past. He says to him, "When I was a shepherd, and when the lion or the bear would come and take one of my sheep," he didn't just prepare for the next time that happened to be ready for it. No, he said, "I sought after the lion. I sought after the bear, and I struck them down." Equating this to what was about to happen to Goliath. Adding that the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. See, David sees the strength of his God, not the size of the challenge. He sees the strength of his God, not the size of the challenge. And Saul, who has been cowering in fear and leading the Israelite army to also cower in fear, doesn't see the strength of his God. Rather, he sees the size of the challenge. And as Saul sees him and his trust in God, he tells David, "Go. The Lord be with you." And then he clothes David in his own armor. That probably would have been quite a sight, because David was taller than any other Israelite. That Saul was taller than any other Israelite, but David was just a youth. And David, wisely, he knows this isn't a good thing. He's not even tested the armor for battle. He takes it off, and he uses that which has served him in the past. A shepherd's staff, a sling, and a pouch with 5 smooth stones. About as non-threatening as you can look. And as these armies are lined for battle on each side of the mountain, within the valley, Goliath is waiting for the challenger, for any challenger to come. out from behind the line of the Israelites' army steps the champion fighter, David, the young shepherd boy David. And as he approaches Goliath, Goliath looks at him and thinks of his appearance as being weak and insignificant, but God delights in using what appear weak and insignificant in the world to display his power to the world. And as David was walking towards him, Goliath begins to mock him. Goliath begins to curse him by his false gods who are powerless to do anything. But David looks at him and boldly proclaims, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied," he says. See, Goliath is standing there in his self-confidence, trusting in his own strength, in his weapons, in his armor. But David, who looks like he is weak and not wearing any armor, is standing there in the confidence of the Lord, knowing that his armor is not seen by man, but is God himself. David adds to what he says to Goliath, that this day the Lord will deliver your hand. And I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. As he says this, Goliath moves forward to David. But David, seeing the strength of his God, not the size of the challenger that is approaching him, quickly moves towards him. And as he moves towards him, he reaches down into his pouch and pulls out a smooth stone and places it in his well-used sling. And as he swings it above his head and fires it at Goliath, sinking it deep into the forehead of the champion fighter. And as the armies are on each side of the valley, looking down at this battle that is taking place, it's as if time has frozen in place. As the unthinkable and the unbelievable is happening, this seemingly undefeatable warrior is slowly falling to the ground. And as he falls face first to the ground, David, who it says is weaponless, moves towards Goliath, takes Goliath's sword, kills him, and cuts off his head. Why was David fighting Goliath? Because Saul, the king of Israel, failed to do what was required of him. You see, it was Saul's responsibility to fight Goliath. It was Saul's responsibility as the king and protector of Israel to challenge Goliath. And if you remember, Saul was a head taller than any other Israelite. He was the appropriate man if you look at it from the outward appearance. But we see that the author shows us that there is a contrast between Saul and David. And that's in their heart. Saul saw the size and the challenge of Goliath, and he enlarged it in his heart. But David saw the size of his God, saw the strength of his God. And he had the heart, a heart after God's own heart that the Lord desired. And as the armies witness the slaying of Goliath, the Israelites who were cowering in fear under the leadership of Saul, they witness their unknowingly future king of Israel, who has boldly killed Goliath. And all of a sudden, they are emboldened and empowered. And instead of trembling in fear, are now chasing after the Philistine army. The Philistines who are running in fear are conquered and defeated by the Israelites. And David brings back the head of Goliath to Saul. You see, we so often look at this story and we think that this is about David defeating Goliath. And yes, it is that. But it's so much more than that. It's how God uses Goliath, an incredible challenge, to display the heart of the king that he has chosen, that he desires. A heart that fully trusts in him. Church, when it comes to our salvation, when it comes to our victory in life, our champion fighter is Jesus. Our champion fighter is Jesus, the only Son of God, who defeated death and sin through his work on the cross. But we know that he didn't stay dead. He was risen to life 3 days later, and through belief in him, we also have life and victory. And as a result of our faith in him, we become a part of the people of God. And in this story, we see the hearts of two kings who rule the people of God, and one who is the king and one who will be the king. We see the heart of Saul, who cowers in fear, and we see the heart of David, who walks victoriously in the strength of the Lord. And as the people of God who have put their faith in Jesus, we must walk as David walked, knowing that our victory is from the Lord, not from what we bring to the table, but it's from what God brings to the table. We must see the strength of our God and not the size of our challenge. No, we may not be on a mountainside like the Israelites and the Philistines were, ready for war where there's Goliath standing there waiting for any Israelite to come and challenge him. But there are moments in life that feel as if we are on the mountainside and in a battle. And we are standing on the edge of this valley, and on the edge of this valley, down below, there is the unknown. And so often, the unknown begins to create fear and just turmoil in our hearts. Or maybe it's the fact that we can't seem to gather enough finances to be able to pay school fees for our kids, or for our friends' children, or for our family's children. Or maybe I don't have enough money to pay the bills, and these challenges are just piling up. The rains haven't come, and there's no grass for the cattle. The fields and the crops are starting to look dead. And it looks as though there's nothing on the horizon. Or maybe there's people in our families or ourselves where our health is beginning to fail. Relationships are beginning to crumble, and these challenges, they're just daunting, and they're waiting. Or maybe they're there right now, and you're facing it right now. But I want to caution us that the more we stare at that challenge, the challenger like Goliath, the bigger and bigger and bigger they become in our eyes. And the bigger they become in our eyes, the less and less we see God. Just as Saul and the Israelite army kept staring at Goliath for 40 days as he would come out, they didn't see and trust in their God. They saw this huge challenge. And God, who is our champion fighter and who provides what is needed for victory, must be who our hearts and our eyes are focusing on. Not the challenge that awaits or that we're facing right now. And we do this through being in His Word, speaking truth and life into our hearts. We do this by learning more about who God is and that is found in His Word, His promises to us that He is sure to keep. We do this by daily reading His Word and coming to Him in prayer. Gathering together so that we can encourage one another, not discourage. So that we can uplift one another, not bring people down. But I also want to urge us to do what David did as he came before Saul. He reminded Saul, or he reminded his own heart, and told Saul of God's faithfulness in the past. And that just as he has been faithful in the past, he will be faithful in the future as well.
Amen.
You see, these challenges that we face that appear too much for us to handle, thankfully, like David, we don't have to handle it alone. We don't have to face the challenger alone. God, who is our champion fighter, gives us what is needed for victory. Our strong God is who we must be coming to, who we must be looking to for our provision. And so we must daily be asking Him in prayer for our needs, for our relationships, for perseverance, for endurance, to continue to be in this fight, and to not give up, for faith, for trust. Asking God for these, and He will provide them. And I want to close with saying that God never wants us to back down or back away from the challenge that we are facing. No, He wants us to boldly move forward into the valley where those challenges await, some that we don't even know about. He wants us to move with boldness into the valley as David did, in the confidence of the Lord. And as David said in Psalm 23, verse 4, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. As we move into the valley in the strength of the Lord, see the strength of your God, not the size of your challenge. Let's pray.